Welcome to the Growth Hacking Culture podcast. Today, we are tackling one of the most persistent and frustrating problems in the C suite strategy failure. You know the drill, you spend months creating a brilliant 100-page strategic plan, but it ends up gathering dust. Your market shifts overnight due to a new technology or global events, and suddenly your plan is obsolete. Your team's paralyzed by fear and uncertainty, revert to old habits, and the company suffers from this chronic strategy fatigue. The core problem is this: most companies are trying to solve 21st century uncertainty with 20th century strategic models. They rely on elaborate predictions that are doomed to fail. And they treat strategy as a document instead of a daily adaptive behavior. Our guest today has a framework designed to fix this broken system. So I'm really honored to welcome Dr. Lance Mortlock, author of the essential new book, Outside In, Inside Out, Unleashing the Power of Business Strategy in Times of Market Uncertainty. So uncertainty is going to be one of the topics that we are going to be touching quite a lot. Uh, Lance, it is a pleasure to have you with me today and have this awesome discussion.
Thank you for having me. We're in two different parts of the world. You're in Switzerland, and I'm all the way in Canada across the Atlantic.
But there is so many similarities, in fact, between Switzerland and Canada. I have the godfather of my daughter living in Canada, and I can tell you when he sends me the pictures of the beautiful mountains that he sees, it's amazing. It's amazing. There is culturally, I think there is a lot that of similarities, especially about certain sports like hockey. You know that hockey is so popular now in Switzerland.
Yeah, I do. You have a good hockey team, not as good as our hockey team, but
We,
but
unfortunately,
we share the love of mountains. We share the love of cold ice-based sports. So yeah, there's a lot of common ground there.
Lance, I wanted to discuss a little bit more about your book. And I was skimming around and I was trying to understand and trying to remember these old times strategy models that I have learned once upon a time when I was younger. I had a lot of hair, long hair, even, Dr. Lance. And there is your framework moves beyond simply analyzing market forces. Does the inside out perspective explicitly address the human element of strategy, the mindset, the culture, and individual employee behaviors? Is there a way to an angle that you have taken for that side of the human side of strategy?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll take a step back. Firstly, thank you for having me on your podcast. It's a pleasure to talk to you about my favorite topic, which is strategy. And I think strategy comes at a time when organizations are dealing with, immense uncertainty, risk, complexity, and ambiguity. And as you point out, and we'll get into the framework maybe a little bit later, but through my experience working really 25 years with all kinds of organizations around the world, is this idea that you need to think about the outside in and the inside out perspective to make winning choices in the market in terms of where to play and how to win. And as it relates to your specific question around the inside out and how it ties to people, um, I think it's essential that organizations think about how they organize, how people work, how they collaborate together, how they drive momentum in the organization to support, winning choices, whether it's, you know, the operating model itself. And so what's an operating model? It really is how companies plan to execute their strategy from the inside out and deliver value to their customers, to their stakeholders. So it's the tasks, the activities, the processes, the capabilities that characterize the company. And that's made up of people. And so if you can organize those people in the right way in support of what you're trying to achieve strategically from the inside out, I think you're partway there in terms of achieving, you know, winning choices related to where to play, how to win. Equally, you need to think about the outside in as well. And we can get into that maybe kind of later in the conversation.
Mm, I have impression that you have taken every single framework of strategy that has been written back in the 80s and you have questioned every single model to integrate this inside out approach. Is that correct, my reading, that you have gone so through every single model that maybe you have used in your day-to-day job back in the days, and but you have reframe it in a different manner? Is that correct, Lance?
Yeah, that I wouldn't say I've been through every single model. I mean, there's hundreds of models out there, and my book took me 5 years to write. This one would have taken me, maybe 10 or 20 years to write if I'd looked at every framework. But I looked at the main ones, and I do believe that the book is a comprehensive analysis and summation of good frameworks that should be used as it relates to different components of the strategy, and and how they fit together. One thing that I would say that's important is you can overdo it in terms of frameworks, and I talk about this in a book. I recently wrote an article on this, published in CEO World magazine, around the death of strategic thinking can be the overuse of frameworks.
Mm.
So there's a real fine balance, and there's a human element to this, that if you think that plugging information into a 2x2 is going to solve all your problems in your organization, you've got another thing coming, and you can't get away from the importance of the human element, the creative thinking that needs to happen to win strategically. Frameworks can help, but it isn't the answer to everything. And I think that's a typical mistake that some organizations fall into.
When you say some organizations, you include certain strategy and consulting companies too, because I have the impression that they sometimes went too far away in terms of the use of framework. It is appealing to see in a slide the summary of everything that the essence of the company, but it, as you said, it doesn't solve the problem, and this is where today, with the rise of AI, we say, oh, AI can do that. And by the way, I have done it myself. I have done the prompt in order to classify, cluster different type of data, and it does a good job. But then the edge of these strategy consultants has diminished. What do you think it could be the role of this strategy consultant in the near future, as the job that they used to spend time on, uh, in most of the cases or in some cases, is a little bit replaced by the use of technology? What can be the edge that AI cannot give to corporates?
Yeah, good question. And it's something I think that professional services companies are thinking about all the time, which is the transformative impact of AI will, in some cases, fundamentally change how organizations serve companies in the future. And one of the things that strikes me is the importance of agentic AI and the role that agentic AI plays in support of teams of advisors working with different organizations, um, and how that might over time sort of change the model of um, staff that you bring in from university, and how succession and all of that works. You're going to have much more of a hybrid, workforce, and we're already seeing it. AI, particularly agentic AI, incredibly powerful.
Mm.
It can do things at a speed that used to take 2 or 3 days, but The future will be, and I think organizations that win in this space will be those that embrace the technology. Ignore it at your peril. But by embracing it, I think it enhances, the value that can be provided, and also the speed with which that value can be provided. It does mean that we need to think differently about the skills and the capabilities that we bring to market. Experience, creative thinking, connecting the dots, um, much more high-end advisory in nature, platform-based solutions. That is being worked out, I think, by all kinds of professional services companies as we speak. So it's going to be interesting. Watch this space.
Hmm.
We spent 250 billion as a global society on AI last year alone. We spent 2.5 trillion on digital as a global society last year alone. So when you talk about 2.5 trillion, 250 billion on AI, like these numbers are massive. And are we getting the value out of the investments that we're making as a society? I'm not so sure. But it's big numbers and it's going to continue to grow.
Hmm. I wasn't planning to discuss about this, but now that I started to think about it, one of the things that corporations haven't been happy in the last 5 years about the use of strategy consultants was the fact that there was not enough skin in the game. That you come, you do the recommendation, and ciao bello. So that's the that's the end of the service. Do you think that with the fact that we have agentic AI, it can help a little bit put more of the strategy consultants in accountable of the results, because agentic AI can probably measure some of the results of the outcomes of the strategy that they have recommended, and maybe that even the model of how we do consulting in the future could be based on the results uh, of these recommendations. Do you see if that could be the contribution of how AI and strategic consultants can work hand in hand?
Yeah, potentially. And maybe certain organizations would build and deploy their own agentic AI agents that become internal consultants to their company, and then they use external consultants to validate the results.
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
Right. Yeah. So I think none of us really know the answer to this question yet. And it's being worked out as we speak. One of the things that I think we need to carefully think about is, what does succession look like when you have, and it's the same problem in the private sector and the public sector. If you have this sort of layer of agentic AI agents that works in an organization, either in a consulting firm or in a client, in an organization. And then you have this management layer and then senior management layer. How do you create succession for the future? And, we got to work through that. I think
Hmm.
workforce models have been turned on their head.
Indeed. When we look at the individual level, so nobody, any human would hate uncertainty. And in corporations, employees often experience fear or paralysis with this uncertainty. And today, the uncertainty is growing because of the complexity of things that happen in the world, because there is more information comes to us in a speedy way. Um, and I fear, and I have the impression that adds to the complexity and uncertainty that we have in the world. Uh, what is the single most critical shift in terms of leadership behavior that CEOs have to become better to build an organizational culture that is resilient and actively thrives in continuous change rather than just merely coping with it.
Yeah, I mean, I maybe I'll give you a couple of facts and then get into your question. When you look at the percentage of risk and instability and the risk of global catastrophes, according to the World Economic Report on this last year, that percentage of risk of instability and global catastrophe was at 54%,
That's a lot.
um, which is a lot. And the other fact that I would give you that I think sort of plays into this is last year, 8 out of the 10 of the world's most populous countries held elections in 2024, which is 4 billion voters. And when you think about that, there's a huge amount of change in terms of policy, in terms of regulation, and therefore that has an impact on business. Because if policy and regulation is changing, how you maximize the choices you make in terms of where to play, how to win, needs to change to in some way to sort of support that. So back to your question in terms of leadership, I think from a leadership perspective, leaders like never before need to be able to deal with that risk and uncertainty, be resilient. Another stat that I would share is 1 in 10 CEO appointments fail within the first 2 years, according to the Global CEO Turnover Index last year. 15% of companies in the top growth quartile sustain performance for at least 30 years. So like that number is small, and it means that, it's getting harder for companies to stick around for longer, and it's getting harder for CEOs to stick around for longer. I just think that there's so much being thrown at CEOs that like resilience is super important. And this is also why, I think my book came out at such an important time where dealing with that outside in world, but also the inside out world, which you asked me about earlier, is super important. Like you've got to make sense of what's going on in the outside world incredibly quickly. You have to deal with the risks and uncertainties. You have to deal with your internal complexity. And that is, I think, the leadership challenge of our age.
Hmm. You made me think of one of my favorite authors, Nicholas Tayeb, who wrote the Black Swan book, and I have the impression that even though it doesn't happen that often, um, actions like the tariffs to Canada or to Switzerland, by the way, we got slapped also by the
Did
US.
you? Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And it doesn't happen that often. And despite that, you mentioned that there is billions of people who have been voting during this last year. Uh, I mean, in principle, change of regime doesn't affect that much in policies, but it's enough that to have one Trump in our lives and things change drastically, and we are not ready to forecast when this is going to happen, and it has a big impact in the life and in the industry, in the companies. Many companies in Switzerland today are really scratching their heads to find out what is going to be the real impact in terms of pharmacies, in terms of watches, and all of this commodity trading that Switzerland is famous for. Uh, is there a way to build that type of resilience for when unique actions that doesn't happen that often in terms of probability is low, but when it happens, it slaps you in the face like big time?
Sorry, like I didn't quite understand that question. Can you run that by me again?
Yes, it is. Is there a way to make CEOs ready for uncertainties that do not have such a high probability of happening, like what happened with Trump, for instance, is
Yeah.
unique, and we nobody expected that this was going to be a major change at the global scale.
yes, my experience has been the use of, and I talk about this in Outside In, Inside Out, but also in my previous book, Disaster Proof, um, this idea of future thinking and scenario planning, which I think is an underrepresented management tool that can really help CEOs think about, the good, the bad, the ugly. And I've used it with a lot of success over the years with big corporations, but also medium and small corporations, where you develop a vision or different visions of the future, good, bad, and ugly, and play it out and say, at the end of the day, if this scenario plays out that could be super bad, tariffs, on watches, on pharmacy, on all the great things that Switzerland creates. And what would we do? How would we react? What elements of our strategy stay the same? And what do we dial up and dial down based on the ugly happening? But then equally on the good side, like, let's say something incredibly positive happens, are we ready to sort of maximize the uplift around that? And I think it's important to stretch your thinking. There's a great psychologist in the US called Joy Guilford. She talks about this idea of you know how you expand like your thinking, and sort of widen the aperture, but then quickly like coordinate and align on the actions that you need to take. And I call it sort of, let's wallow in the ambiguity for a while as humans and say, well, what if that happened? What if that bad, ugly scenario played out, the good scenario? Let's play with that thought process strategically as an organization before I work with a lot of companies that have a lot of engineers, and they love to sort of design things and focus on the actions and the steps. But are we getting to the action too quickly and not spending enough time wallowing in the ambiguity? And I think that's super important. Scenario planning can help companies with that thought process, force them to think through things, and then decide what elements of our strategy stay the same regardless, and then what do we dial up, dial down based on the scenario that's playing out real time.
Your recommendation, if we actually put it in practice, is it more a qualitative analysis of probabilities that may happen, or scenario planning, or would you go into statistical models that assess, I don't know, Monte Carlo modeling, in order to assess that this is the probability that this could happen? Would you go into quantitative analysis? Would you recommend that to a CEO, to have a specialist who goes crunches numbers?
Oh yeah, and I talk about the importance of the common, if you like, the common pitfalls of strategy. One of them being not spending enough time thinking about the quantitative aspects of strategy, and the importance of embedding quantitative analysis in the analysis that you do is essential. But then there's also a question of, okay, what's the scale of the organization? I think very big, complex organizations that have a lot of resources available to help, Monte Carlo simulation, game theory, scenario planning can help. But then in a smaller organization, you might not do Monte Carlo simulation. It might be a step too far. You might not have the resources to do that. So I think you need to sort of weigh those things up. I also think, look, there are other pitfalls for sure. I mean, one of the things I talk about in the book is poor execution. You can have a winning strategy, but if you don't execute well, it doesn't matter. And then like not creating strategy with the right level of engagement and buy-in from middle management and employees is another common pitfalls, not making the right trade-off decisions, not, being too blue sky and not practical enough. The time frame, we can talk about that. And then, not simplifying strategy. And then finally, like flexibility, which I talk about a lot. And I think that ties to scenario planning as well. Like this idea that I think Mike Tyson once said, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. And when you get punched in the face as an organization, how do you flex to a different, path of success? So I think you have to consider all of those things.
That's true. What have you observed is the greatest blind spot for senior leaders when they're trying to make a strategy an ambiguous environment?
Um, I mean, I think that one of the big blind spots is, and I talk about this idea of this diamond framework where, it's figure one actually in the book. The idea that you've got like the outside in, the inside out. You prepare for execution and then you execute, and you've got to keep those four segments of the diamond in harmony. One of the big There's two big blind spots for leaders. One is spending too much time on the inside out. And we started our conversation talking about that. What are we doing in the four walls of our company? How's it performing? What's working? What's not? The operating model, etc. But not enough time on the outside in, which is what's happening in the industry, what's happening in the sector, what are our stakeholders saying, what are our customers saying? Do we truly understand the outside world and bring that in, the outside in? So that balance between the outside in and the inside out is blind spot number one. Blind spot number two is this idea that we spend too much time on the left-hand side of the framework, analyzing the outside in and the inside out, making great choices. But the right-hand side of the framework's all about execution. We don't spend enough time truly executing against the strategic choices that we make. Preparing to executing, do we have the right people, the right capabilities, the right initiatives? Are we measuring performance, governance, all of that? And so blind spot, two is great strategy, looks good on paper. We've got the 100-page deck that maybe, those consultants have helped us with. And then, but we fail. We fail to execute well. And so I dedicate half the book to execution because it's so important to get it right. And so many companies struggle with that.
And that's a good thing that you have half of the book on that direction because I have the impression personally that most of the failures come from the execution. It's not about the idea. The idea can look good. Of course, it is an idea that hasn't been validated in the market yet, but is mainly about the execution. I wanted to ask you one question. So when you think about the world of tech startups, and they use different models than the ones that I studied back in university days. They don't talk about Porter analysis of competition, Porter's five forces, or I don't remember exactly the name. They are talking about business model canvas. They are talking more. So it's almost like they have ditched the fact that there is competition. They are just focusing about needs being fulfilled or not fulfilled, and they're building their internal capabilities. So it's a little bit like less about the external world, what is the current competition, and more about needs and internal capabilities. Is there anything that corporations can learn from the models that startups are using in order to be more agile, more disruptive? In fact, I don't give a shit anymore about the competition. I just want to create a market. I think in 20 years ago, it was called the Blue Ocean Strategy or something like that. I want to create a new market with my services, products, new things that I can develop. Is there something that you would advise CEOs to look at, and that can help them in times of uncertainty, that where they can be disrupted by a five people group put together.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, there's a lot you can learn from smaller organizations that are super agile, responsive, and flexible. I mean, Rupert Murdoch once said that in today's world, with the speed of change, the big won't beat the small anymore. It'll be the fast beating the slow. And
Hmm.
so, your point is well taken that we have to move as businesses quickly and be agile. At the same time, carefully understanding, our customer requirements. I mean, one of the case studies that I talk to, well, I'll give you two case studies that I talk about in the book. And there are several hundred case studies throughout the book. But one is around Kodak, the classic example of, they were a multi-billion dollar company, highly successful. They were so vested in the research and the development of their film-based product and the chemicals that were used with that. They actually had a digital camera um, and a digital solution, but from an outside-in perspective, they were like, "No, our customers really don't want this," and they, they ignored it, and as a result, you had this massive company. I think that they were valued at 16 billion. They had a stock price of, $90 per share, and um, and I think they were the fifth most valuable brand in the world, believe it or not. But just in a few years, by the early 2000s, Kodak's, their financial troubles unraveled. They lost market share to competitors like Canon and Sony, and then eventually filed for bankruptcy. Digital photography was indeed poised and became the next big thing, and they shelved their digital camera, and that was the end of it. So they weren't agile, they weren't flexible, they didn't listen to the market research that they had out there. So I think talking to your customers, talking to your stakeholders, talking to your competitors is super important in terms of understanding, what's going on out there. I'll give you a Canadian example. There's a company in North America called Target. They opened, and they were a powerhouse brand, and they opened in Canada, but again failed to understand the different customer needs in the Canadian market and how it was different to the US market. Um, they opened 124 Target stores in Canada in 10 months, spent millions in social media, radio, TV, billboards. But the customers in Canada knew the brand, but when they went into the stores, they saw different products and higher prices than they'd seen in US stores. And um, they made the same mistake as Kodak in some way in terms of not understanding the customer. And in the end, they closed all the stores. 17,000 employees lost their jobs, and they had 5.4 billion in losses. So my point in these examples is, one, the importance of outside in analysis of the market, two, being close to your customers, and three, thinking about your competition.
You made me think about my old days in corporate, and where we were using heavily market research agencies. I have a problem with that, in fact, because I observed that from time to time it happened that they were taking the data, and the insights that they were driving is what the customer wanted to hear. And sometimes I ask myself, why do we need market research when we can go and validate even if we are at the top of the pyramid, and talk to real customers to understand what is going on, to understand needs, to understand what they would do in case something changed, instead of using market research that can be biased in order to keep the customer, they would sell what they want to hear.
Yeah.
Lance, what have you seen?
Yeah, I mean, I, I think, Mark, if I understand your question correctly, that there's a role for market research agencies to sort of give outside in advice, but I also think that companies need to be incredibly close to their customers, and customers are king at the end of the day. I mean, I dedicate a whole chapter in the book to the importance of understanding your stakeholders and customers, from surveys to focus groups to using AI, by the way,
Yeah.
to do some of that research for you. It's incredibly powerful. So, how do you use a suite of tools and capabilities to stay close to your customer needs and use that to inform the choices that you make? And at the end of the day, if you lose sight of your customers and what they want, you're dead in the water. And that, that was the issue at Target, as an example, in the Canadian environment. So, but equally understanding your stakeholders from a policy and a regulatory perspective, back to what we talked about earlier related to Switzerland and Switzerland's relationship with the US, you know, like what is it that the US customer as a whole is wanting? And so how do we reframe our business models to get to a win-win situation? I mean, some would argue it's actually not possible to get to a win-win given what the US administration want. Like they want to win and they want everybody else to lose. But it's interesting nonetheless.
Lance, is there um, a way that the models that you are presenting in your book can help organizations to create like daily routines in order to develop these adaptive behaviors across all levels of the business?
Like how does the framework create adaptive behaviors?
Yes, exactly.
And what do you mean by adaptive behaviors from your frame of reference?
So adaptive behavior, that means that we changes are going to happen, and despite the fact that I have a beautiful document that lays a strategy and potential scenarios, that stuff is going to happen in another way. And it's a combination of resilience, agility that needs to be created. Is your model helping organizations to create this resilience and agility that needs to be done in times of continuous change?
Yeah, I mean, earlier we talked about scenarios. So from that perspective, that helps with adaptive behaviors, in the sense of at the overall strategic level, you need to be willing to dial up and dial down certain things. And I dedicate, an entire chapter in the book to it, as I mentioned. But also, I mean, the other fact that I think about a lot is, 64% of executives say that they have too many conflicting priorities. So I talk quite a bit in one of the chapters around this idea of the importance of prioritization, but prioritizing in a very dynamic way, that you need to recognize that things change and priorities change, and initiatives that support strategically what you're trying to achieve, whether it's a new technology system or a new HR capability, whatever it might be, you deliver on that portfolio of initiatives, but then new initiatives might come out, other initiatives might not be important as the world changes, and you need to be able to dynamically prioritize on an ongoing basis. And I think that that's key in terms of adaptive capability. The other thing that I think is key, I once had the opportunity to interview General Petraeus, and General Petraeus was a five-star general in the US Army. He was also the director of the CIA working for Obama, and he talked about the idea of, the tactical being nested within the operational and the operational within the strategic, and constant efforts to keep those different things synced as the world changes from an adaptive capability perspective. And there's nothing more important than, when General Petraeus was leading 100,000, troops in Iraq, and he was in charge of, the Fallujah push, which from a military perspective was seen as successful, having to be adaptive. And part of that is, the tight integration of different levels of planning and flexibility built into that system that says, when things operationally change or tactically change, that feeds the operation, which feeds the strategic, and then we can flow up and down, through the system. So that's one thing. The other thing that he talked about was this idea of horizons, where you've got what's right in front of you, and I think you have to sort of think about horizon one, but then also horizon two, the medium term, and a horizon three, what we would say at EY, the now, the next, and beyond. And you need to have flexibility in those different horizons, but it's also important to methodically think about strategy in those different horizons and build flexibility in that, as it relates to what might be changing. And often what's changing right in front of you is immediately what you react and adapt to, but you have a vision of sort of horizon two and horizon three, which might be a bit more in the long term, but also important. Motorola is a great example of a company very focused on horizon one, which was right in front of them, but didn't really see horizon two, horizon three in terms of 3G technology coming at them. And, when you think about the result of that in terms of Motorola's business, they struggled to create a new business model around those luxury cell phones, and and they failed as a technology company as a consequence, and lost millions of dollars.
Somewhere I read that one of the most popular and read books in terms of strategy was this competitive strategy by Michael Porter, and that read by by CEOs, that was like kind of the reference. I wanted to ask you, so how is your book different? Is what a CEO that is reading, even a senior person or somebody who inspires to be a CEO out there, how is your book different versus the classical strategy Bible?
Yeah, I mean, listen, Michael Porter is the godfather of strategy for sure. Probably one of the things that I most appreciate about, there's a lot I appreciate about Michael Porter and the work that he's done, but the quote he once said, the essence of strategy is choosing what not to do. And I think that ties back to, I talk about the importance of prioritization. Too often organizations spend too much time focused on delivering too much average versus a few things, particularly well. In terms of your question, I think what I tried to do in terms of outside in and inside out, and what's different, is four things. One, a lot of these books out there are complex to read, understand, and apply. So, number one, I've simplified strategy into its core elements with a very simple diamond framework, which we've talked about a little bit on this podcast. number two, I think there's the right way to strategize. I reveal in the book different frameworks for businesses to manage both the external and the internal factors, and I think that's unique. We talked about that blind spot number one, but also the importance of execution, which a lot of books fail to address, which is blind spot number two that we talked about. I think the third thing that I did, and I took some inspiration from Good to Great, that timeless book around the idea of like really clear and effective lessons, real world examples, my own experience having advised 80 organizations, in 11 countries over the last 25 years, but also public case studies and techniques that have worked and failed around the world. And then the final thing that I would say is, look, we live in this world, this risky world of business. So I think that there's a real lens in terms of risk, but also opportunity that I apply to the book that I think is unique as well, that CEOs are dealing with all this risk and uncertainty. And this comes at a really important time where I think we need to kind of fit different things together in an integrated way. And I talk a lot in the book about the different components of the diamond and how the left hand and the right hand need to be integrated. And often, particularly in large organizations, that falls down. And I talk a lot about how that comes together. So that's a long-winded answer to your question there, but I think it's important. It doesn't discredit what Porter and others have done. But I think those are some of the things, the simplification, the case studies, the easily applied framework, how I've really addressed execution, the combination of outside and inside thinking and bringing that together to make winning choices. That's what truly makes this book unique, and it comes at a super important time.
I have my personal opinion about that. The fact that it is based on real experience. I mean, whatever we say, most of the books that talk about strategy are conceptual. Sometimes it's somebody who is teaching in university. The fact that you have that you are basing your book on real experience, based from on some cases with your 80 plus customers, it's not a back to school moment. It is about somebody who speaks the language that I would use in real business. And that's what is needed today. Somebody who
Yeah.
can make it easier to digest something that is complicated. And despite the fact we hated school, so we don't want to go and read school stuff. We want to have real cases. Thank you, Lance, for doing this.
Yeah, no problem. I mean, look, there are, I mean, you think about the classic textbooks like Mintzberg's book on strategy, very theoretical, hard to like apply sometimes. I've tried to approach the book as using simple language, like a balance of some frameworks, not too much, because, as I pointed out, we don't want the death of creative thinking, tons of case studies, a little bit of research, because you want that rigor. And, as an associate professor, like I need to have some of that rigor in terms of how I apply and how I think. But any CEO, any management team, any board, any middle management can pick this book up, and there's something in it for them. I've maybe given away too much, by the way.
That's great. We want generous people in life, Lance. It was really lovely to speak to you. I hope really that is going to trigger the interest about doing strategy in a different manner, considering the human side, what you have as capabilities, capacity inside of the organization, looking at the business in a more pragmatic way. I would really recommend people to read the book Outside In, Inside Out, Unleashing the Power of Business Strategy in Times of Market Uncertainty by Lance Mortlock. And Lance, it was really nice to have you with me, Canadian brother.
Yeah. Thank you for having me too. A pleasure to speak to you.
Thank you. Have a great day.